There are very few characters as ubiquitous as the title one himself, but if there was anyone that I think has risen to be one of the most prominent characters of the franchise, it would be James. Someone who started as a sort of background character, I find actually has a very interesting story upon further inspection. He is often described as vain and narcissistic.
Oh, please.
So I wanted to examine what that really means and who James is as a character. Is he really the total narcissist that later seasons made him out to be? Is he a good guy? Well, let's first discuss what narcissism is in the first place. To put it simply, the type of narcissism we think of when we associate with self-centered characters like James is called grandiose narcissism, which the third edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders describes as grandiose, arrogant, entitled, exploitative, and envious. I'm sure hearing all of these words, you can associate at least one of them with any moment from James's screen time in the series. In this video, I not only seek to point out these moments, but by the end of the video put forth a reason for why this is. So it isn't enough to simply look up a definition on Google for me. I wanted to understand how NPD develops. For this, I looked up a few papers, and the one that explains it best to me is Thomaeus's. Thames? No. The important thing is that it's not Thomas, because we already have a Thomas. Anyways, they simply say, first, older children and adolescents become increasingly self-conscious and concerned about how they are viewed by others. Second, they are easily shamed and humiliated, emotions that are intimately related to the maintenance of self-esteem. Third, they increasingly use impression management strategies, or acting cool, to try to influence the opinions that others hold of them. While there is also research that tells us the level and stability of self-views is partially heritable, and MPD is more heritable than any other personality disorder, I think because we're talking about an anthropomorphic engine, we're not going to be talking about heritability. I don't even want to try and figure that out. Instead, I'd like to focus more on the social circumstances, like in the first quote, that I theorize made James the way he is. So for the sake of this video and the argument I'm going to be making, that will include only external factors that may have contributed to James's narcissism. This will include going over what we witness in the original stories, as well as looking at supplemental material for added context. I really want to get as complete a picture as possible for James's story so that we can understand who he is and what made him that way. By going over what we find, I'd like to examine select moments where I think James shows these traits and analyze not only how these fit into our definition of narcissism, but what they mean for his story. So let's start at the very beginning, before James ever came to the island of Sodor. Yes. In the book The Island of Sodor, Its People, History, and Railways, the primary source of lore from Audrey himself, it is explained that James was in fact an experimental design, and his front bogey was made to mitigate the nose-heavy design his brothers faced. It is then stated that James's added bogey did nothing to actually fix that issue, and while I think we can infer that may have caused him great shame, to add to the terrible state he is in, when James finally does arrive on Sodor in his bleak black livery, he has his infamous crash on his first day. So while it might be a bit arguable that being a failed experiment could cause such drastic self-esteem issues, having a crash like James did on his first day is guaranteed to. From what I've read, it seems one of the main contributors to the narcissism we see has to do with being unfulfilled. In Cahoot's words, the grandiose character in the overt display of infantile grandiosity evolves from archaic, unfulfilled narcissistic needs that are split off, or repressed, early in childhood. I would like to think that James definitely had some qualities of narcissism before we were properly introduced to him, and just didn't have the opportunity to show it. And even though he probably didn't spend very long on his native railway, being created for a particular purpose with expectations being held over you can no doubt lead to problems with the self. And to then become a disappointment for a whole class of engines can deeply affect someone. I would argue that coming from that environment where he felt ostracized and outcast probably led to a greater desire for obtaining status, something we'll see come up later when he becomes one of the big engines. This can also be supported by more research done by Cahoot, which agrees parental coldness, extremely high expectations, and lack of support may lead to narcissism. So let's just substitute parents with his designer in this case. Children create inflated, narcissistic self-views to protect themselves against feelings of rejection and worthlessness. These children are also believed to crave positive attention from others to compensate for a lack of parental warmth. This is the crucial piece of information I want to look at for this discussion, as I want to shape our understanding around this idea of James's narcissism as a mask. When I say this, I don't mean to say James is consciously rude or arrogant to others for some ulterior motive. I think he's really developed into a narcissist because he started at such a low point, only exacerbated by the fact that he was given a very unique livery from the rest of the engines, and uses that to create this image of grandeur. This doesn't just come from Cahoot's research though, as Miller et al. Would go further by saying that content from the narcissistic neuroticism domain, shame, self-consciousness, feelings of insecurity, might be the most critical to narcissism if one follows psychodynamic mask models of narcissism that see grandiosity as a facade that hides deep-seated feelings of self-doubt. Using this, as well as Baumeister and Vohs' stance that narcissism can be viewed as a pattern of addiction to self-esteem, leads me to understand James as one who is constantly searching those self-esteem highs, because he is actually a very sad character who hides his feelings under outward grandiosity but can never feel that true contentment because he thinks the only way to feel value is to have status. In Universe, we can explain him repeatedly making mistakes or acting brash through these reasons, as a constant struggle to satisfy his self-esteem. The next notable moment in James's story is when he joins the other big engines on their strike against shunting, because they believe it is beneath them. But what we should note here is that this was all planned and organized by Gordon, who James sees as the pinnacle of status on the island, since he pulls the Express, the most prestigious job. He's big, he's strong, etc. So he follows him in this strike because he wants to be part of something that will give him that sought-after status. And while we think of grandiose narcissists as people who will not compromise their image for anything, in actuality, narcissists continuously seek and create situations in which they can enhance their self-esteem. I think in this moment we see James jump on this bandwagon and really cultivate those narcissistic traits because this group and his unique livery gave him that self-esteem high he felt he needed so badly. These ego boosts help mask these feelings of inferiority that he carried with him in these first moments. We can see this mask as a defense mechanism for him in most of his interactions after his big crash, especially when it comes to his image. Most conversations where we see James at his most antagonistic will likely have to do with when his abilities or appearance is called into question.
Make way for an important engine. You wouldn't feel important if one of those trees crashed on you. You'd feel hurt, reproached Percy. Rubbish! It wouldn't dare!
James is very aggressive with trucks, for example, because it's almost impossible to feel superior to constant beratement.
Oh, said the trucks. We want a proper engine, not a red monster.
The kind of reaction we see is also supported by other research. Both experimental and fieldwork have shown that narcissism predisposes children 8 and over to behave aggressively, in particular when they suffer a blow to their egos. And it is a rather fragile ego that James is so quick to defend because it's already been through the gutter. Trying to cover his insecurities with blatant ego in typical sort of fashion only gets him his comeuppance instead. Sadly, this seems to be the vicious cycle James lives through as a narcissist on the railway. And while similar things happen to others like Gordon and Henry, they are able to grow from those lessons, like how Gordon and Thomas create their alliance, and for Henry, I would say the tunnel definitely taught him some things. And yes, he still acts pompously sometimes after that, but he would never make that same mistake again. And this is where I want to talk about James's relationships, because while Gordon and Henry or Thomas and Percy have moments where they get, to borrow a phrase, too big for their buffers, followed by learning their lessons, James has these moments but remains egotistical. The key story that comes to mind is Old Iron, when James speaks particularly rudely about Edward, and Edward has to come to his rescue after he runs out of control. We see a lot of character boasting, then something happens to make character learn their lesson plot from this series, but with James, it seems to happen the most, either to make other characters look good, or to have a good action scene. Or both. But especially in the show, we never see these moments really affect him. Sure, we'll have the I'm sorry moment at the end of the story, but sometime later he'll revert back to being the same way. And this I found to be consistent with what NPD research suggests. These individuals are actively self-enhancing, vindictive, aggressive, exhibitionistic, and exploitative, while denying significant emotional or interpersonal stress. Thus, while they perceive themselves positively with regard to their experience in relationships and are likely to be dominant and assertive, others would likely describe their impact upon others more negatively than they themselves would perceive. As the song tells us, he's a splendid fellow, but he really is quite vain. And this isn't just the classic series either. Even the ending roll call during the hit era says something along the same lines. He just doesn't seem to recognize the extent of his ego while others have to constantly put up with him, which certainly gives credence to the coined term oblivious narcissist. His vanity is an undeniable character trait, and the way these lyrics speak about it, it would seem as though everyone around him has accepted that. Additionally, in a study done by Dickinson, the grandiose narcissists they surveyed reported interpersonal difficulties of a domineering/vindictive nature, low interpersonal distress, and the majority selected attachment styles associated with positive self-representation, secure or dismissive. James's relationship with Toby immediately springs to mind, as he insults him for his appearance, and when he is met with opposition, he then seeks to take control of the conversation by referring to his paintwork. This conversation ruins his mood for the rest of the day, and after his accident, he says nothing but looks away in shame. This, it seems, is the status quo for how others interact with a narcissist. It is simpler just to disgrace and punish them. Through his efforts to make himself look more individual, James ultimately ends up becoming more isolated because of his adversarial orientation towards others. Narcissists' efforts to maximize self-esteem are often counterproductive and ultimately inhibit the praise they seek, which is what we see at the end of Dirty Objects and many similar stories. It will always be James's ego that will be his undoing. But this makes me wonder how Thomas and his friends live with James. What does James do that keeps him on the railway? Well, obviously he's a good enough worker. I mean, he's a mixed traffic engine. He pulls coaches, he pulls trucks. That seems good enough. But this question is the one I want to follow for the next part of this video. Is James a good character? And I mean good in a few ways, but for the most part I mean, is he good morally speaking? Does he make good choices? Is he a good friend or contribute to his community? At this point, I'd like to tell you the question that inspired this video. Why doesn't James have a hero story? We see a lot of the main cast get these stories. Edward's exploit, Henry in Super Rescue, Gordon in Down the Mine, Duck in A Close Shave, the list goes on. All of these characters have shown their virtuous sides at one point or another, all except for James. And I really thought over this, but I could not think of a single story from the books or from the classic series where James did something heroic or completely selfless. And when researching narcissism, it started to look more and more like James was this self-absorbed jerk who was somehow allowed to stick around despite everything he does. At this point, I'm going to back away from the research because I want to make absolutely sure we all know that I am not a clinical psychiatrist or anything. I just like to talk about this stuff. So this part will mostly be just my opinion. I don't believe James is a complete and utter narcissist, which, if I can mention my sources one more time, is completely possible, since like most things, narcissism is a spectrum. But while most grandiose narcissists are thought to be completely self-absorbed without any empathy for others, this view just doesn't seem right for James. There are several moments where I think James shows that he is capable of showing empathy. There is the aforementioned moment in Old Iron where James admits Edward is a hero, of course. This is definitely important as it shows that even though it may not stop him from being a narcissist in the future, James is still capable of apologizing and conceding to someone else. Another more subtle but equally important moment that really struck me was in Four Little Engines, or Old Faithful in the books, where James almost has nothing to do with the plot. But at the end of the story, one where Skarloey overcomes a malfunction to bring his passengers to the station, despite being late, James remains respectfully silent. Now, as we know, James is not afraid to voice his opinions on someone, even to their face over petty things. But the fact he can silently and respectfully acknowledge the achievement of this engine who is literally smaller than him is a big moment that says something about his character. It's a small moment, and such a less is more one too. It tells us that no matter how self-absorbed he is, or how often he will think of himself first, he is able to step back and acknowledge others when they've earned his respect. There is one more rather minor moment for James, and by extension Gordon and Henry, and I think it's kind of neat. In the story Bowled Out, the diesel that comes to the railway introduces himself by completely and utterly undermining the engines and their railway to their faces. This leads to the Big Three using their iconic lines,
Disgraceful.
Disgusting.
Despicable.
What I enjoy about this tiny moment is that we've heard these words used to ostracize and pass judgment, sometimes wrongfully, and always because the bigger engines feel personally insulted by someone. These earlier moments were also around the time of the strike that was completely egotistical, so when the three are passing judgment like this, it shares that same shallowness. But when we hear it now, it's not because of a personal insult like old square wheels or galloping sausage. It's because this guy came in and started insulting their entire railway. They condemn him now as older characters who are offended not just for themselves anymore. For James, I think this moment tells us that he doesn't see himself as entirely above his peers. When a diesel comes in and insults them, he insults him, and feels the need to defend that community. With all that said, it's hard to say there's an even balance of virtue and vices in James, and so it would seem likely that, as an audience, we would dislike him as a character. But interestingly, it's really quite the opposite. Lots of fans really love James, and many of the writers in the community can't get enough story material out of him. More on that in a bit. Even the head writer for later seasons, Andrew Brenner, named him as one of his favorites. So why do we like this character, despite everything we know about him? Well, I have a few small reasons, and one big reason that I'll touch on in a second. First of all, it's entertaining. James's personality is one of the central reasons for conflict in almost all of his stories, and we like that. Honestly, to me, James is like the embodiment of when you see two people fighting on the street, where you obviously don't want there to be fighting, or for them to be fighting you, but when watching you just can't look away, because of how ridiculous it is. I think this also means it's satisfying for us when James does end up getting his comeuppance, because we see it as a kind of justice. That sense of relating to that issue is almost universal. We've all at some point encountered someone who is, to borrow that phrase again, too big for their buffers. Whether that be full-on narcissism or just someone being selfish. So I think we know that feeling of wanting them to get what's coming to them, or maybe just finding them entertaining, like Toby. As I've said before, this show really understands that flaws are a part of us and a part of life. Even the characters we love will be foolish, and sometimes we love them more for that very reason. We embrace the flaws of those characters for relatability and for entertainment too. That is exactly what leads me to my third and final reason we love James: the potential. I mentioned this already, but James has been the center of many fan stories and continues to star in so many because of the plethora of possibilities his character holds. I told you that what inspired this video was how I couldn't think of an official hero story for James, but that has not stopped fans in any way from showing James's good side or even redemption in some sense. Two stories I wanted to highlight here were A Proper Day's Work by TARDIS Rescue and Rescue and Redemption by The Buried Truck. Both of these stories are phenomenal, so please go watch them. For this segment, I'd like to highlight how they both use James as a protagonist, not just to teach moral lessons through his failings like most do, but actually show how he is able to rise above his ego. A Proper Day's Work is a very unique story featuring James, as are all of TARDIS Rescue's videos. Please go watch them. It shows us James at his busiest, grumbling and complaining, as he would, which leads to him causing an accident, but instead of him getting chewed out for it, he meekly hurries away, and puts all of his effort to make everything else go right for the rest of the day. By the end, James is rewarded because he worked hard and wanted to make up for his mistake, rather than be shamed for it. The story really breaks the formula of Audrey's writing to tell a more nuanced tale, one where a mistake doesn't define you so long as you can make the effort to be better. I think it's a great story for James, who is constantly making mistakes, and being ridiculed for it in a vicious cycle. It serves as a great addition to his story. Similarly, Rescue and Redemption does wonders for James as a character. It centers around one of James's main arcs in the books, that being his prejudice towards Diesel, and really comes to a satisfying end to his arc, in a much more meaningful way. In the books, it followed that same sort of formula where James makes a mistake, says something boastful, then gets his comeuppance. To add insult to injury, he was also infamously taken home by a Diesel we don't even know the name of, thus making this story feel so disjointed as any kind of resolution. In the Buried Truck story, James starts as indignant to Diesel, but when the newest Diesel to the island, Bear, gets insulted by one from the mainland, he actually reflects on that moment, and decides to help him look better than the other Diesel by the end of the story. What is so good about this story is that it doesn't rely on fate or happenstance. The lesson is seen through the direct actions of James himself. I really like how this story plays into that good side we see in him sometimes, and interestingly, him not taking credit for it really fits in line with that silent praise moment we talked about earlier with Skarloey. I love both of these stories, for what they say about James, for what they say about us as people, and because they represent what fans do best: imagine. I was especially adamant about this in my first video when talking about Project Tiger Moth, but it is just as important here. For this purpose, I want to come back to the words of Henry Jenkins. What I love about fandom is the freedom we have allowed ourselves to create and recreate our characters over and over again. Fanfic rarely sits still. It's like a living, evolving thing, taking on its own life, one story building on another. each writer's reality bouncing off against another's and maybe even melding together to form a whole new creation. We've given ourselves license to do whatever we want, and it's very liberating. For a character like James, the possibilities are endless because he has the potential to be redeemed or to be the foil to anyone. James may be a narcissist, and he's far from perfect, but what these stories show us is that it's not impossible to connect with someone we may find disagreeable, and perhaps change is possible for them, even if it can only be found from themselves. While NPD is yet to be entirely understood, what we do know is that, like I said before, it is a spectrum. So maybe there will be people like James who are difficult but have their moments, or maybe there will be others who there's just no reasoning with. But I think at the end of the day, what matters is that we give them a chance. Before I end this video, I just want to thank you for watching. I'm really amazed at how far this channel has come in just the past few months, and for all of the positive reception. It means a lot. I want to thank everyone who has watched my stuff, whether it be the Thomas essays, the Daredevil read-throughs, or even that one Doctor Who video that's there. I also really want to thank everyone who subscribed because, wow, we are almost at 1,000, which is literally insane. I really appreciate the support, and I try to post on the community page as much as possible to let you guys know about any and all stuff if necessary. So please leave comments here or there or anywhere if you want to tell me what you think of James or if there's a topic you want to hear about. I really love hearing all the comments. They've been so insightful and just a great chance for conversation. Thanks again, everyone. Goodbye.